All right. My name is Linda Jackson, and I'm a member of the Marin chapter of the League of Women Voters. This presentation I'm going to give was created by members of the Marin League of Women Voters. It is about the 19th Amendment, when women received the right to vote. It's also the 100th anniversary of the founding of the League of Women Voters. The League adopted the slogan of 100 years strong to represent the strength and the passion of the women who worked for the suffrage, for the right to vote for women, and it was generations of women who worked on this project. I've been wondering about the women in my family and where they were when the 19th Amendment was adopted. My mother was born in 1917, so she was only 3 years old, but she grew up knowing that she could vote. Her mother was an immigrant, so no doubt was busy with the realities of taking care of the family and helping them. I'm not sure she couldn't vote until she became a citizen years later. My other grandmother died in childbirth, so in 1905. She was not alive, and I don't know what my great-grandmothers were doing in 1920. So what did your mothers or grandmothers or great-grandmothers do in 1920 and before, when there were marches and all the work to get the vote? I invite you to think of them as I talk and remember the efforts that were made. Were they involved in the battle, or did they fight on the side of the antis? This presentation was created by the Marin League of Women Voters based on the book, The Woman's Hour by Elaine Weiss, which is available at your local bookstore. Winning the vote required 72 years of ceaseless effort by 3 generations of women. The women who launched the movement were dead by the time the amendment was adopted. And the women who secured the final success weren't born when the effort started. It was an exhausting and brutal battle. And throughout the struggle was embedded the same grim racial dynamics and prejudices that we see today. So let's get started, and I'll begin with the summer of 1848, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and a few other ladies decided over tea, following attending a convention on abolitionist rights, they decided to host a women's convention in Seneca Falls. There should be a convention for women as well as for the slaves. Just a few days' notice, over 300 women came together for the first gathering of people to discuss a declaration of sentiments. Renowned abolitionists Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth both attended the Seneca Falls Convention. The sentiments was a radical proposition. From the Declaration, we can read that the history of mankind is a history of repeated injustices, injuries, and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, the establishments of absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And here were 2 of those facts. He has compelled her to submit to law in formation of which she had no say. And having deprived her of this first right of a citizen, the elective franchise, thereby leaving her without representation in the halls of legislation, he has oppressed her on all sides. This statement you see here, in particular, to secure the women's sacred right to the elective franchise, proved exceptionally contentious. Frederick Douglass rose in the convention, making a passionate plea, stating that the ballot is the key to liberty and women must be bold. It's reported that it was his statement that made the difference in the voting, that helped the Declaration of Sentiments pass, albeit by a very slim margin, just the first of narrow victories across the country in the decades to come. 2 years later, in 1850, Lucy Stone, another important leader in the suffragist movement. And she was the first woman in America to keep her own last name when she married. She organized the first national convention on women's rights. About 900 people attended, 3 times more than in Seneca Falls. Susan B. Anthony attended. She came as an abolitionist, but she became a convert to women's rights. And the next year, Susan B. Anthony met Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They became one of America's sharpest political duos, with Stanton doing the writing and the thinking while she raised her children, and Susan B. Anthony doing the speaking and the traveling across the country. The two collaborated for over 50 years. Let's fast forward from 1850 to a pivotal moment in the suffrage advocacy by Stanton and Anthony and others, to the early years after the Civil War ended in 1865. But first, let's pause for a moment to listen to those who are against suffrage. And here is one of the most succinct arguments. The woman who undertakes to put her sex in an adversary position to man, who undertakes by the use of some independent political power to contend and fight against man, displays a spirit which would, if able, convert all the now harmonious elements of society into a state of war and make every home a hell on earth. The truth is, not just this comment by an elected senator from Oregon, there were particular interests that did not want women voting. Liquor and brewery interests were fearful of the growing temperance movement, and rightfully so, because the 18th Amendment was prohibition against alcohol. Corporate interests were fearful of women who were advocating for better working conditions, rights for women and children in the home, and justice for women in the political and economic world. And there were the railroad interests. They fought against efforts to regulate the railroads, accessibility, and working conditions. Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass were leading political spokespeople about suffrage up into the Civil War. Anthony was a renowned spokesperson for women's suffrage, and Douglass was a brilliant and charismatic abolitionist. Tragically, right after the Civil War ended in 1865, Southern states began adopting black codes to limit the freedom of the freed slaves. The paramilitary group Ku Klux Klan came into being with widespread white mob violence against black communities. To establish citizen rights for freed slaves, Republicans brought forth what would become the 14th Amendment. They were debating the 14th Amendment, and this offered women great hopes for universal suffrage at last. They thought they would get the suffrage because Congress was talking about voting rights, federal voting rights for everybody, but not so fast. When all persons in the draft amendment was changed to male citizen, the women were crushed. Douglass recognized that there was a fragile political reality for the black man. He supported the 14th Amendment because he knew that the changed wording was essential to enfranchise the black man who needed the vote to protect themselves and their families and their communities. Stanton and Anthony protested loudly everywhere, bitterly, about the adopted wording of the 14th Amendment. And it all fell apart when the 14th Amendment was not enough in the end to protect the black man in the South. So Congress sought the 15th Amendment, which says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucy Stone begged to add one more word to this list: sex, and thus enfranchise everyone. Frederick Douglass understood that the political reality, again, was that the white elected leaders were willing to give black men the right to vote. But the political and economic interests and the male leaders in Congress were terrified by the idea of women voting, and especially black women voting. Despite his support for women's suffrage, Frederick Douglass had as his priority the black man's right to citizenship and suffrage, and he gave this passionate explanation why black men needed to have the vote. When women, because they are women, are dragged from their homes and hung upon lampposts, and when their children are torn from their arms and their brains dashed to the pavement, when they are in danger of having their homes burnt down over their heads, when their children are not allowed to enter schools, then they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot. And he was asked, isn't that not true about black women? And he says, yes, 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 it is true of the black women, but not because she's a woman, but because she is black. Well, Stanton and Anthony worked desperately against the 15th Amendment, which passed without suffrage granted for women. They were crushed. Well, Lucy Stone was devastated by the lack of women's support for the step to expand the voting franchise to black men. Douglass and Anthony, who were friends and political allies, were not speaking at this time. The damage to the suffrage leadership by the debate over black suffrage was so deep that the 2+ decades long coalition split. Lucy Stone and friends formed the American Women's Suffrage Association, and they focused on the state-by-state effort to grant women the right to vote. Stanton and Anthony formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, and they were working for the constitutional amendment for women's vote, and for various social justice issues. And for the rest of the century, and for a whole generation, the two organizations followed two distinct political strategies. So let's talk about the state-by-state work. It was a slog. And California is an example of what the battles were like. The first suffrage vote in California wasn't until 1896, 30 years after the Civil War. By this time, the Liquor Dealer League was well prepared to fight the suffrage attempt in California, particularly in urban areas like San Francisco and Oakland. And they worked diligently, and they defeated the proposition resoundingly. It was another 15 years before the measure came back up to the state of California. There was a progressive Republican government elected, and the suffragists seized this opportunity. In 1911, in the campaign, this time the women were more organized and better prepared. They had discovered that the winning argument was not equality for women, but that by virtue of women's right in the home, in the fields, and in the factories, that they had earned the right to vote. So this message was sent out across the state, including to meetings here in Marin. The morning after the vote, the early news was based on the urban vote, is that the proposition had failed again. Marin itself voted 58% against the proposition. But the rural votes kept coming in slowly, and by a margin of 1 vote per voting precinct, it won. and California became the 6th state where women could vote. Finally, after years of separate efforts by the two organizations, they came together and formed the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And they had been pursuing the right to vote, but by unifying their strategies, it was just so necessary that they needed to work together to take this to the end. In 1914, Carrie Chapman Catt became the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. It now had a board, trained officers. Catt set about creating throughout and all the states an association to lead up for the ratification effort that she saw on the horizon. She had trained under Susan B. Anthony. She was a master of political strategy. Alice Paul had studied in England and became radicalized, if you will, by the women's suffragists in England. They were much more militant than in America. She had originally joined Catt's group, but then she broke off on her own and formed the Women's Party in 1916. She organized the protests in front of the White House, which were controversial because they happened during the First World War. There were marches that she organized in major cities. They forced arrests of women, and she would honor them with a pin showing a prison gate in ceremonies, hunger strikes, and massive parades. And the question is, what organization would you have joined? The National American Women's Suffrage Organization or the Women's Party? Well, Catt was right in her vision that the time had come for what was called the Anthony Amendment. She believed that women's support of the war effort in 1917 would lead men to approve, finally, what was called the Anthony Amendment. At the same time, as more and more women across the states were receiving the right to vote, men in other states could see that they were going to lose power in the long run if they didn't enable their women to vote. In 1918, 102 years ago, the Anthony Amendment passed the House by exactly the 2/3 majority needed. But alas, it failed in the Senate. So it was brought back the next year, 1919, and in a special session of Congress, the measure passed the House again, this time by an overwhelming majority. And on June 4th, 1919, in the Senate, after 70 years of working, it passed again with a margin of 4 votes. So then the amendment moved on to ratification by the states. The women needed 3/4 or 36 states to ratify the amendment for universal suffrage. By the summer of 1920, 35 states had ratified. They needed just one more. And that was judged to be the great state of Tennessee, judged by the suffragists to be the most likely to say yes. Being a southern state, though, the suffragists had another interest, in addition to the liquor interest, the railroad interest, the corporate interest, another power factor to combat, and that was states' rights, a residual from the Civil War used in the South to describe the power to keep the political economic system that was in power at the time, preventing black men from voting, and a specific fear, not just of women voting, but of black women voting. The story of the debates, the motions, the quorums, the delays in Tennessee is rife with power struggles. The women in Tennessee were in 3 groups. There was the Catt's group, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, Paul's Women's Party, and then the antis, the women who campaigned against ratification based on states' rights and casting fear about women voting. The truth is that both Catt and Paul, this time, much as Douglass saw after the Civil War, understood the political reality of the moment and of the argument, and they did not speak up for suffrage for black women. In fact, they made the point that there were more white women than black men, or than black women, and would thus outvote them. The liquor industry in Nashville rented a room on the top floor of the Hermitage Hotel, and they had a room where legislators could come and drink and become drunk, so maybe they wouldn't show up for the vote at the House. The suffragists and their male supporters, all wearing yellow roses, would track down the legislators and make sure that they didn't sneak out of town, and they showed up for their votes. The Senate was the first to vote. They passed the amendment 25-4. And on August 18th, 1920, the amendment reached the House for a vote. Final debates and maneuvering. No one was positive the votes were there for ratification. And it was a young legislator, Harry Burns, who casted the deciding vote, following receiving a plea in a letter from his mother to vote for ratification. That 36 state voted to ratify 49-47. There was a ticker tape parade in New York City. And in the election of 1920, 36% of women voted. That was compared to 68% of men. And that has steadily improved over the years. It was a start in 1920. So now a little bit about the League of Women Voters. Carrie Chapman Catt had envisioned years before that there was a need for a nonpartisan group to educate new voters. And when she saw that the 19th Amendment was on the horizon, she and others formed the League of Women Voters on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1920. Today, the League has grown to be a strong, respected force nationally. It is a nonpartisan organization. The mission is empowering voters, defending democracy. The vision is a democracy where every person has the desire, the right, the knowledge, and the confidence to participate. And the values are centered around our belief in the power of women to create a more perfect democracy. The League of Women Voters is an organization fully committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion in principle and in practice. What does it mean to say the League of Women Voters is nonpartisan? The League of Women Voters neither supports nor opposes candidates or political parties at any level of government. And it always works on vital issues of concern to members in the public. The League extensively researches issues and may adopt a position based on the core values of the League. Positions are listed on our website. I'll invite you to take a look at them. We have positions on all the important topics of the day. In Marin, our chapter was formed in 1936. It was during the recession before World War II. Our population in the whole county was about 60,000, which is about what San Rafael is today. Recently, we had a round table with longtime members Ann Batman, Suki Sennett, Ann Leisure, Marcia Hagan, Sue Beidel. They shared stories as far back as 1969, 50 years ago. They talked about the studies that the League did about schools and education, Marin City and housing, a dam, international trade, the Buck Funds, a water moratorium, a ranch, and an airport. They talked about watching boards, editing newsletters, and being roped into serving on a committee or the board. And they remembered past League President Vera Schultz, who served as the first elected woman to Mill Valley City Council and then to the County Board of Supervisors. Schultz was instrumental in the creation of the world-renowned Marin Civic Center and of the unique and essential whistle stop, which serves older adults throughout Marin County. The journey toward universal suffrage continued all through the last century. It's important to note that Black suffrage leaders such as Ida B. Wells and Mary Terrell were dashed by the political arguments of the white suffragists in 1920. Literacy tests, residential requirements, poll taxes, intimidation, and violence prevented Black men and women from voting for the next 40 years. Native Americans weren't able to vote until 1948. D.C. residents couldn't vote until 1961, and 18-year-olds couldn't vote until 1971. The voting rights effort continues to this day as the legacy of voting restrictions continues with the dismantling of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The League, which was formed as part of that early struggle 100 years ago, is needed today more than ever. For example, our efforts at ending gerrymandering in the 2010 elections has been a major factor in moderating partisanship in Sacramento and is an example being used across the country by other leagues who want to make sure that every vote counts. And other pressing issues at hand include climate change, affordable housing, social justice, educational equity, and immigration rights. It's all still on the table. For information about the voting rights struggle, I want to give a shout out to the Marin County Free Library, created this website about voting rights, complete with resources and links and good reads. It's your go-to source of information, both locally and beyond. I invite you to remember your mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers this year of 2020. I invite you to join the League of Women Voters and empowering voters and defending democracy. Thank you.